Thank you for joining today for part 2 of the Free Deployments webinar series brought to you by Codefresh. Just as a heads up, this webinar is being recorded and we'll post it on YouTube so you can watch it at a later time if you would like. And feel free to visit us at codefresh.io/events for future webinars and conferences and things that we'll be at. If you have any questions, please use the chat function or the Q&A window, and I'll get this started and introduce Hannah. So Hannah Seligson is our speaker today. Hannah works as a developer evangelist at Codefresh who loves to create content that empowers developers with resources and tools. With that, I'll hand this over to Hannah to kick off part 2.
Hey, Sharon, and everybody can hear me okay? Alrighty. So thank you, everyone. As Sharon mentioned, this is part 2 of a 3-part series. And our series is focusing on infrequent deployments. During webinar 1, we identified different types of deployments, their frequency, and today we'll be focusing on data and metrics that apply to those deployments, and finding solutions and ways that we can improve the deployments. So don't worry, I will be sure to reiterate the different types that we reviewed in webinar 1, and then I'll be diving into today's presentation, reviewing the metrics and data that we can use to improve our deployments. Oh, and so as, oops. There we go. So as Sharon mentioned, my name is Hannah. I am a dev evangelist for Codefresh. Prior, I was a .NET dev that focused on API development. And if you're new to Codefresh, we are an enterprise GitOps platform specifically for Kubernetes applications. So real quick, just before we dive into the presentation itself, we do have a poll that we would love you guys to participate in. So today's poll, we're going to ask if you are familiar with these 4 key metrics that I'm going to be explaining today. They were researched and created by the DORA Research and Assessment team. So if you would just take just a minute right now to answer the poll. Just let us know if you are familiar with these metrics, and if you are, do you use them? Do you measure them? We would just love to know. So just take a moment, a pause while you do that. Okay. Now, if you are new to these metrics, I will be sure to dive into each one. And something that I've noticed across the board is that a lot of people, they explain these concepts, but it still leaves question as to how to actually measure these concepts, how to actually apply them to your current deployment. So within this presentation, I'm not only going to identify what they are, but I'm also going to suggest some ways you can measure them and apply them to your current deployment process. So as mentioned, today's topic will be reviewing those metrics. And before I do so, I will be sure to reiterate the different deployment types that we reviewed in webinar 1 and just briefly explain which type is deploying frequently, less frequently, and some of the pain points that are associated with those. So the 3 deployment types that we previously reviewed was the Dark Ages, the Renaissance, and the Industrial Revolution. So the Dark Ages, it's what you could imagine. It's if you're guilty of deploying maybe once a month, maybe once every 3 months, it really, it's essentially known as a release train and even an anti-pattern. So if you are guilty of this, oh, I'm sorry. It's not the best approach, but sometimes you can't help it, just depending on your organization or the software, or the type of applications you're working with. But just a little bit more insight into the Dark Ages. It's, as I mentioned, if you're deploying to production specifically, your production environment, every 1 to 3 months. It's also if you treat your deployments as if they're these giant events, and they include multiple teams. So not just your immediate dev team, but also include your QA, business, your DevOps team, or what have you. Also, if you are submitting code and you're a developer, it's going through a never-ending process just to merge your code and to release it into production. So that would be qualified as the dark ages. And then also, if you're just creating, really complicated rollbacks. So let's say you do deploy something to production and there is some sort of outage, there's an error, a bug, what have you. That process to roll back is a labor-intensive manual process. So there's no automation, and it's something that could entail several teams and can be a huge, huge headache. And then there's the Renaissance. This is a little bit better than the Dark Ages, clearly. It's something that you're deploying maybe every 2 to 3 weeks. So this would essentially be at the end of a sprint. So like I had mentioned, depending on how you plan your sprints, the Renaissance would apply to deployments at the end of the sprint. And then within those sprints, they are being organized based on really complicated features that you're adding to an application, something that's not as simple to implement, and the entire sprint is focused on these new features that you're adding. Also, this type of deployment process allows devs to have self-service access to a test environment. Sometimes this is inevitable, just depending on your organization and size and resources. But it's essentially those developers who are not just, executing unit tests, but also your automated testing or what have you. And then also you're still performing your rollbacks manually. It's still kind of a stressful process, I guess, when you hit a bug or some sort of service outage. This would also be part of the Renaissance deployment process. Okay, now the last deployment type is the Industrial Revolution. And this is essentially if you are deploying much more frequently. So if you were able to deploy 15 minutes ago, you've already deployed twice for the day. It's something as if on demand, you can deploy to production. And typically, this is the best case scenario, but it does take some sort of modernization or just, providing some sort of new workflow to your team. And if you're wondering if you're considered part of the Industrial Revolution, this is essentially, do you have the ability to deploy to production easier, much more quickly, much more frequently than either the Dark Ages or the Renaissance? Also, are you able to detect failed deployments to production quickly? Do you have some sort of visualization to that? Are you also able to perform your rollbacks automatically? This is a big thing. So you're not spending or scrambling trying to get other teams involved, and it isn't a manual process. Also, are you able to focus your sprints on not, like I mentioned, those more complicated features to an application, but maybe focus more on business requests? So if an end user is requesting a new feature, you're focusing on that because you're able to provide that feature a little bit more quickly, and you have that workflow already in process. So like I'd mentioned already several times, if you are part of the Industrial Revolution, you have a deployment process that isn't just relying on all of these different teams, but if you are working with these various teams, you're able to work a little bit smoother, and there isn't any sort of reliance on one another that would hold anybody up. So that is just a brief reiteration of the 3 deployment types that we reviewed in webinar 1. And now I'm going to dive into those metrics that I asked you about earlier and explain how you could apply those metrics to any of these deployment types. Even if you are deploying to production on demand or quickly and frequently, there's still always ways to improve. So I can't stress that enough. So as mentioned, the data metrics that we're going to be reviewing that you can apply to your deployment process are going to be your lead time, your frequency, the failure rate, and just the turnaround for restoring services if there's some sort of outage or something is down, what have you. And I would like to reiterate that these metrics, they're not new. And we certainly at Codefresh did not come up with these, although, you know, that would be cool. But they were actually 6 years ago, were conducted by the DORA, which is the DevOps Research and Assessments team, which I believe is now incorporated with Google. So this is something that's been around for a while. And like I mentioned, we're going to explain each one, and then I'm going to provide ways that you can actually measure these data metrics and apply them to your current process. Okay, well, you know, why do these metrics matter? Sure, we can improve, but I think it's also important for teams to understand what their current process looks like and how it operates, because it can provide a lot of insight and understanding about how the team is working, how you're developing new features, and also how quickly, or maybe not as quickly, you're able to provide your end users with the new features that they're requesting. But also another huge plus is ways that you can understand how you level between your competitors, because it's nothing new that those organizations that are able to deploy much more frequently and provide users with their requests are doing. They're typically the most successful. And so this is a way, it's important to understand the process, not just from a business standpoint, obviously, because it'll improve it, but also it helps improve just the workflow for your teams. And it allows developers to develop, and they are able to see their code in action. It creates a sense of pride, but also it just, like I said, it really helps your organization as a whole. So and I should mention that the first two metrics that I'm going to be reviewing, these two metrics are essentially the easiest that you can measure. So please, pay attention and feel free to ask if you've, in the chat, if you have any questions. I'll be sure to take a moment to see if you do have any after I share them. But otherwise, you feel free to ask questions at the end of this presentation. So the first metric, as I mentioned, is lead time for changes. This is essentially, the measurement that it takes from when you are submitting your code within a PR, and then it's being deployed, merged and deployed to production. And it's essentially that entire flow, that process. So, and what I'm going to explain are kind of like these high, medium, lows. And so right now we're going to focus on measuring the time it takes from submitting your code within your repo and then merging and releasing it into a production environment. So let's say, in comparison to the deployment types that we just reviewed, the best case scenario would apply to those who recognize as the Industrial Revolution. So if you're deploying much more quickly, so those who are, they might be able to submit their code and see it within a production environment in 15 minutes. Then another great statistic is 1 hour. Then there's 1 day, and then a day to a week. So maybe if you find yourself in those deployment types that are anything but the Industrial Revolution, you might see yourself in the medium to low category. So how do you measure this? These are just some suggestions that I provided. However, there are several other ways you could do this. First is utilizing triggers within your pipeline. So this way you can maintain an actual list of changes that are being included within a deployment. Then what you should do is really review those deployments, and then you can refer back to timestamps of the commits and changes. You can actually see, okay, this is when that code was committed, and then this is when that code was released. So having something or some sort of technology that will allow you to view that. And then you want to be able to calculate the average lead time that you're noticing that it takes to commit your code and then release it into production. So this first metric really isn't too hard to measure. Yes, it could be time consuming, but it'll allow you to understand that frequency and be able to really understand how quickly you're deploying. So we'll dive into the second metric, which is essentially your deployment frequency. How often are features actually being released to your customers? So as I mentioned before, when you are submitting code for a new feature that was requested by an end user, how quickly or not quickly is that user able to see that new feature? So as mentioned before, the best case scenario would apply to those who have more of an industrial revolution deployment type. So it would be on demand per feature as quickly as you can. High would be multiple times per day, medium every day, or low once a week, or maybe just once a month. And also, I think you should identify what this feature may be. A feature could be something really simple like a navigation, a new service, it depends. So, but that's up to you and your organization to discuss and to identify. But certainly these two types of metrics are by far the easiest metrics that you can apply, measure, and discuss within your organization to have a better understanding of how your teams are working. So I definitely suggest that teams begin some sort of deployment review, taking the time to really understand how this is working, because ultimately the more you understand your deployment process, the quicker you'll be able to work. And I think it's just a huge benefit. So now we're going to dive into some of the more complex metrics, and I'll also explain how to measure those, and we'll go from there. Oh, sorry, I jumped ahead. But essentially how you would measure these, it's pretty self-explanatory. So the frequency in which your end users are able to see these new features, you can first identify what constitutes as a successful deployment in your organization. Sometimes I have to admit, I feel like successful deployments, it just varies. Like I'd mentioned, for those who might be stuck in the dark ages, a successful deployment could be something as simple as, it could be something where there's just no sort of hot fixes that you need to immediately or only include hot fixes, don't create some sort of outage. Or it could be something that a successful deployment is that everything has been tested successfully, and then it was also tested within your staging environment and then released to production with no problems. It's something like I'd mentioned that some of these metrics do need to be defined by you and your organization and based on your processes, what works for you. Because then what you can do is you can calculate the average of these successful deployments, and you can base those on the week, the month, just depending on how often you are deploying. So definitely first identify the frequency of these deployments, and then secondly, understand what is a successful deployment for your team. Because like I mentioned before, the ultimate goal is to deploy as quickly as you can so that you're able to provide these new features to your end users so that you are ahead of the competitors. That is a huge thing. And that is how you ultimately will be able to grow your organization, but also improve your processes and have a better understanding of what is being released into production. And this is just these two metrics I mentioned. I can't stress enough that you at least have this sort of understanding. Okay, now we're going to get into some of the more complex ones. And these are going to be based on failures. And what I mean is, how often is a deployment failure or an error occurring when within your production environment that is going to require immediate attention from your organizations. So this is pretty important. And hopefully your office isn't on fire when you have to put out these bugs or some sort of service failure. But the best case scenario is that the percentage of changes to production that do require remediation. So let's say that you are submitting something to production. How often are those deployments in a percentage require some sort of failure I guess, basically putting out a fire. Best case scenario that you don't have this problem. So it would be from 0 to 5%, high 0 to 10, medium 0 to 20, or low 20%. You're spending a lot of time just, trying to fix bugs, trying to resolve outages, and so forth. So how can you measure the change failure rate? First, I would identify what constitutes as a failure or an incident, because like I'd mentioned, it really does depend on your organization. For some companies, it could just be, a hot fix. It could be just a simple bug, or it could be something like a service outage or a build pipeline failure. It's up for you and your team to identify that and to categorize that as a failure. And then what you want to do is, once you've identified those, how many deployments that were attempted to release to production, how many failed? This way you are able to identify the percentage of your releases, how much are those were successful? How much are those failed? This is just as important to understand as the successes. Because if you do notice that there's a higher percentage, which I really hope is not the case, that you at least have some sort of process to execute this and to improve this, to lower this percentage rate of failures. I think it's so important for you to understand also what is causing those failures. It could be some sort of workflow that you and your organization have implemented that just isn't working. And it could really highlight some of the weaknesses or pain points within your process, and then give you a chance to brainstorm and find new solutions for that. So I want to share some real life service failures or outages. I think a lot of these you're probably already familiar with. GitHub recently had an outage for at least 2 hours. Another one, which was a huge one, was Facebook. And then also Fastly. And you can imagine these outages and the effects that they have, not only on the end user, right, but also on your organization. Just that kind of business impact that it would create as far as your profits, your reliability for your end users, it really sinks. And then also it just creates chaos, which none of us want. We want to avoid that as much as we can. So this is just incredibly important to understand, so that you're not guilty of some of these companies and provide a poor experience for end users, and then also just affect your business or your organization in a negative way. So metric number 4, when you do have these failures, what is the time it takes to restore them, so that they're no longer, that everything is peaceful, everything is fixed? You need to understand that when those failures do happen, how long does it take you to fix them? So understanding this time frame is crucial, and the best case scenario is that it just takes you a few minutes, right? But sometimes it could take a few hours, it could take a day. But if something is taking more than a day, that's not great. That could also just create more and more problems that are stacking up on one another. And if you don't have some sort of understanding or some sort of safety net to prevent these errors from happening and understanding how to fix them, it's a problem. And it's something interesting, like what I mentioned in the previous slide about real life, these real life companies suffering from this. You'll notice that people are like, oh, well, this was the cause. This is what caused these outages. And you want to have that understanding before it happens. You don't want to be sit there and spinning and just trying everything you can. So I can't stress enough how important it is to be prepared and to understand these failures, so that you and your team are not scrambling. So how can you measure this? Really identify when was your last incident, and then, understand how long it took to resolve that incident. And that could be done numerous ways. Like I had mentioned before, it could be just a commit. It could just be, seeing when something was committed, created an outage, and then when you were able to identify that commit created that and then resolve it. Or, luckily, hopefully you have some sort of automated rollback system to avoid that. So really, if you have some sort of GitOps workflow, you're able to see a log, a history of your commits so that you can easily just look at that, see a signature of when a developer submitted this code that created some sort of failure, and then have an automated rollback. Or hopefully you have some sort of system that notifies you of this issue beforehand. However, sometimes it's inevitable, like with the bigger companies that we just reviewed, but nonetheless, it's still something that you should really review and understand how long it took. And if it did take longer than a day, think of just maybe smaller ways you could, or smaller solutions you could apply to reduce that to maybe just an hour or something like that, so you are prepared. So here are just some reviews on those metrics. Like I'd mentioned, these metrics, some of them are not the easiest to measure, and it can be time consuming, but it's certainly possible. And then also, if you are just looking for some sort of quick comparison to get a ballpark idea of how things are going within your deployment process, start by estimating the metrics in your current process, not in your future, not in your previous, just currently what you're working on now, and review that. Also, just investing time, if you do take the time, and like I had mentioned, create some sort of deployment review with other managers and other teams within your organization, it really will allow you to understand this process a little bit better, and then you're able to identify what is and what isn't working. So I did go through that a little bit quickly, but I would just like to mention, and I'm going to be here for questions, and also there's some other things I want to share with you. But within our next webinar that we're going to have, it's going to be a webinar that focuses on essentially Codefresh. We want to share a little bit about who we are and how we can also help your deployment process, and how honestly you can measure some of these metrics that I shared a little bit easier. And so if you're thinking, well, I don't even know where to start, I don't even have the software technology to have some sort of visualization or measure these metrics, I definitely suggest, checking out Codefresh, because what we have is we actually have a GitOps dashboard that is it's powered by Argo, if you're familiar with any of the Argo projects. And it provides a visual of failed and successful deployments, along with measurements and data. And so I can't stress enough, if you do create, check out Codefresh, really check out our GitOps dashboard. You'll be able to see it within the UI, and it will provide just this, you can create a pipeline, and it will create just some sort of basic understanding for you. And then you can also get into much more details if you'd like. And so, like I mentioned, it's you can sign up. It won't cost anything. And currently, we are actually coming up with a new platform, and it'll be within the new year. And this new platform for Codefresh, it will provide additional Argo support. So as I mentioned, if you are familiar with any of the Argo projects, this new launch for Codefresh will include support for Argo CD, Argo rollouts, Argo workflows, Argo events, but it'll be for an enterprise. It'll provide enterprise support, and it'll enable teams to manage and also just to understand their applications and monitor their deployments from an enterprise scale. So I'm really excited to share some of that with you, because definitely some of these deployment types and just understanding how they're being executed, it's so crucial. And so, I'm really excited and that's one of the reasons we're sharing this with Codefresh, is because we do provide some of the support that you're looking for. We do provide some of the answers that you're looking for with this deployment process. So Oh, yeah. So, and also I would like to mention that we do have additional content on these deployment types, and we also provide just much more content understanding these current processes and just trying to figure out ways you can improve. So we do have an ebook, we do have a blog post. And as mentioned, I'm going to stick around now because I did end this a bit early, just with any questions you have about your current deployment process as much as I can. And if you have actually tried to implement any of these metrics within your current process, I would love to know how you're able to measure them. What were your takeaways? Really, just please feel free to share and let us know, because I think it would be important for people to learn from others as well, not just from us. But yeah, so if you would, I'm going to keep an eye out on our chat, see if we have any open questions, and I'm just going to stick around and see if you guys have any follow-up questions or concerns. So, and thank you for joining.